Maryam. Today is the 8th anniversary of the end of my life. 8 years ago today, my mother walked with me to the palace doors and handed me over. My father, the French trader, had been to the palace a week before with his friend Abdul by his side to translate. They had talked with person after person at the Shah's court, until they eventually gained an audience with Fatima, the Shah's second wife. It was up to her whether or not I would gain a place in the Shah's harem. She posed questions to Father and Abdul about what kind of girl I was, whether I was obedient and biddable, or whether I had a rebellious streak that would need to be beaten out of me. I was told that she hesitated quite a while on learning of my mixed heritage, but relented once they told her I could read and write several languages. It was just my luck that Fatima was one of those odd women who values literacy in a girl. 8 years ago today, my mother roused me from my bed in the little bedroom I shared with my sister. My sister was the daughter of 2 Persians, so my parents were confident of finding a good husband for her one day, and had no need to find an alternate place for her. Together, my mother and I prepared breakfast for my father and my 5 brothers, as was our duty before any other task. Once they had eaten and we had cleared it all away, we grabbed the little traveling packs of food that we had prepared and set out for the palace. I bid them each an awkward goodbye, but none of them seemed to much care that I would never return to that house. I shouldered the bag of clothes and books I wanted to take, tucked most of the food inside, and pulled out a small loaf of barberry bread slathered with honey to nibble as I walked. Our arrival at the palace that evening was nerve-wracking. My mother pulled me aside before we made our approach to the gate to warn me that everyone at the palace had been told I was a good girl, and any display of emotion or misery because of the upcoming change in my life would cause them to think otherwise. And if the palace turned me out, I could not come home, but would have to survive on my own. I took a deep breath and resolved not to make a peep. I passed this test I had set for myself. I kissed my mother's cheek as she turned to leave, then turned around with no expression on my face to look at Khadija, the Shah's 3rd wife, and the woman in charge of settling me into the Shah's harem. She beckoned to me, and I followed her like a little lamb. She took me into the harem rooms and showed me a tiny doorless cell off the main room that was to be mine. I set my bag down and looked around the little space. It was extremely small, having room in it only for a little table and a bed, big enough for a single person. I busied myself arranging the few things I had brought in the small space, then peeked my head out the doorway to see a large chamber furnished with cushions and rugs. It was nearly empty of people. The few ladies that remained in it were stretching and yawning, as it obviously was their bedtime. An elderly man moved around the room, tidying up things that ladies had left behind as they left the room for their beds. Khadija paused on her way to do something, saw me, and said, "Go to sleep, little one. We will give you more instructions tomorrow." I curled up under the adequate but not luxurious bedding on my cot, and hugged my doll close to me for sleep. Before I knew it, the morning call to prayer was echoing in my ears. I was up, dressed, and moving toward the door before I realized I had no idea where I was to go for prayer. I woke up enough to see where all the other ladies were going, and managed to get through prayer without making myself stick out too badly. After breakfast, I was taken under the wing of one of the older ladies. Over the next little while, I learned many things. I learned the protocols for dining. We ladies were served by servants, and didn't have to serve our brothers, fathers, and husbands. This was a nice change. I learned how I was to groom myself to keep attractive for the Shah. Though I was only 8 years old, I had this grooming done immediately, in case his fancies should unexpectedly shift and fall on me. Once the initial changes to my appearance were made, I was expected to maintain myself looking that way. I learned by watching how a woman could put on an eager, enticing front to hide the fear in her heart when the Shah called her to her duty. I knew, even without being told, that any display of fear or reluctance would dissuade the Shah. He was not a monster, I was repeatedly assured, but a woman who failed her duty to him was not fit to be kept in the harem. And I learned through a horrifying demonstration in the palace courtyard one day what happens to those silly girls who dare to pretend that they exist for any other reason but to serve the Shah. One morning, the harem was abuzz with the gossip that one of the other girls, a few years older than I, Aliyah, had been caught at the palace walls, in the act of climbing over them to make her escape, aided by one of the palace guards. The two had protested that they loved each other, but were taken to the dungeons and held separately. Later that afternoon, every girl and woman in the harem was ushered down to the courtyard, where a platform had been erected. Aliyah and the guard she loved were marched out and tied to the platform. The executioner's sharp blade glinted in the harsh afternoon sunlight as he raised it high. The shocked silence afterward was broken only by stifled sobs from some of us younger girls. Khadija spoke into the silence. That is what happens to those of you who choose to deny yourselves to the Shah. Offering yourself to any other man is a death sentence for both of you. You are kept here in the palace in luxury and security, and you owe your service to the Shah until he dismisses you. Now back inside, all of you. We turned and silently marched back inside to the coolness of our shaded rooms. The conversation gradually picked up, and we shook off the pall of the demonstration we had seen. But the knowledge remained ingrained in our collective consciousness and colored all our interactions from that day forward. One day, Fatima came to me and asked for my help in translating a letter that had been written to her in French. I had been so caught up in learning the finer points of my new role here that my French seemed dim in the back of my mind. I took the letter and translated it into Persian for her, but the effort exhausted me. I had dark rings under my eyes by the time I presented the translated document to Fatima. She looked at me sharply as she took the pages. "Have you not been sleeping, child?" She frowned at me. "I normally sleep very well, thank you, Banu Fatima. It is only the effort of remembering my French took its toll on me. You must tell me if you think I have translated anything incorrectly." She scanned the Persian document quickly, but didn't seem to see anything amiss. I knelt quietly, waiting to be dismissed. She looked back down at me. "Have you been to the palace library?" The word library acted on me like a djinn spell. I perked up immediately, fatigue forgotten. "There is a library, Banu? I may visit it?" She smiled at me. "Of course you may, Azizan. There are palace guards stationed outside the door. You may ask one to escort you there to select some volumes. But you must study them here in the harem, unless you have a male escort to stay with you inside the library." I thanked her for the information and was halfway up to my feet, ready to grab a guard and rush to the library, before I realized I hadn't yet been dismissed. I looked back at Fatima, and she was laughing at me. She waved her hand and said, "Yes, go, exercise your mind." I thanked her once more and rushed out of the room. From that day on, I did little else but read my way through everything the library contained. I learned about things in many different fields, information I would probably never have a use for. But I felt it could not hurt to be prepared for whatever life might throw my way. And losing myself in a text helped take me away from the petty rivalries and endless debate on how to best display one's charms that pervaded the harem rooms. The months and years passed in a blur. I reached the age of 14 before something happened to jolt me out of the comfortable routine I was in. One morning, Khadija came to my cell and grabbed me by the arm. I dropped my hairbrush and grabbed my veil as I was tugged out of my cell and brought to the front of the group of assembled women. We all stood facing the little door in the wall behind which the harem servant normally dwelt. The poor man had died 3 weeks past. I still missed him a little bit. He had been a comforting, non-threatening presence in the harem since I had arrived. Most of the other ladies seemed not to notice that he was gone. I wondered why we all stood clustered around the door to his empty room now. Khadija knocked on the door and put the key in the lock to open it. We could hear someone scrambling on the other side of the door, presumably trying to make themselves ready to meet us. Khadija turned to me. "This boy was picked up on the Persian border. He is to be our new harem servant. He speaks only French, so you must be his companion until he learns enough Persian to be able to fulfill his new role." She swung the door open to reveal a skinny youth about my age, dressed in rough clothing. A mask covered the right side of his face, and I felt a burning curiosity to know what was beneath it. I suppressed this desire, however, knowing that if he was self-conscious enough about it to hide behind a mask, it was not my place to uncover it. I explained to him that I would be his translator, and trailed after him and Khadija as she showed him what he was expected to do for us ladies each day. He understood nothing, she said, and looked to me to help him understand. I had a sudden memory of my French father speaking to me, and a wave of memory of the home I'd left washed over me. I closed my eyes to savor the image for a moment. then banished it and focused on my task. After a week or so, the boy had settled into his new role, and I found myself again with free time. He still needed me a few times throughout the day, when someone was trying to give him new information, but for the most part he was capable of surviving on his own. I went back to the library and borrowed a stack of books that I had not yet read. I was curled up on a cushion in the harem rooms, reading an interesting treatise on herbal medicine. Then I sensed someone standing over me. It never pleases me to be interrupted while I am reading, but I mastered my irritation as I looked up to see who it was and what they wanted. My gaze was met by two green eyes that captured my interest immediately. It was the new servant. "What are you reading?" he asked. I showed him the treatise, and he asked me to give a summary. We fell into a discussion of the principles contained in the text, and he brought up several good points. I did not feel myself obligated to take a submissive role in the discussion, as this boy was no better than me by virtue of age, station, or family role. So I found the courage to stand up to him and argue against several of the things he said. He, in turn, did not treat me as inferior, and listened to the things I had to say. It was a strange sensation for me to speak thus to a male. I wondered if all women enjoyed this freedom where he hailed from. From then on, he would generally join me over my books in the afternoon. He generally understood anything I tried to explain to him the first time I explained it, and he was quick to pose questions about the topic, extrapolate conclusions from the data, or even make up little jokes about the subject. I learned that his name was Erik, and he had traveled here from France with a traveling circus. He would not say much about what had happened to him with the circus, but I knew that often there were displays of human oddities that traveled with those establishments. I still had never seen what lay behind his mask, but I decided it must be bad enough to warrant his inclusion in such a show. I began to feel somewhat sorry for him, thinking of the horrors that I imagined he had experienced. My pity for his deformity, my admiration of his nimble mind and tongue, and my gratitude that he treated me as equal, combined in my mind and slowly brewed into a powerful attraction. One day I had him accompany me to the library to take out more books. He wandered the shelves as I did, but paused to read titles far fewer times, as he only spoke French and a bit of Persian, and only read French and a bit of Latin. I'd been trying to teach him some English too, but there were few of those volumes in here, I knew. The library contained even more languages than the 5 that I am fluent in, so I knew what it was like to have to pass over volume after volume, unable to decipher the information it contained. Our search separated us for a time, but then our meandering paths through the shelves converged again in a dusty back corner of the library. I literally bumped into him as he came around a corner, my attention being riveted on a volume I had not seen before, poking out of a shelf. His arms came up defensively as I bumped into him and recoiled. I felt blood rush into my face and I began to apologize. He shook his head, grabbed my hand and kissed it, saying,
"No, it was my fault. I wasn't watching where I was going. Forgive me, Maryam?"
His green eyes met mine. I dropped my eyes immediately and yanked my hand back with more force than strictly necessary. His gentle touch and use of my name had sent my attraction to him to new heights. I reminded myself sternly of the consequences Aliyah had experienced for her infatuation with the palace employee. I was here only to serve the Shah, and Erik had no place in my thoughts. I couldn't help wondering, however, if he felt the same attraction. It was a game for me to play when I lay awake in the night, imagining that neither of us were bound by palace rules and obligations, but instead could express the desires of our hearts to one another. Then came the night that I fulfilled my purpose. The Shah interrupted Erik and I one night when we were playing a game of chess. We'd been speaking of the history of chess, how it seemed to have originated in this region of the world and spread over the globe from here. Suddenly I found myself hauled to my feet by the Shah, who seemed in a ferociously bad mood. Does he want? No, he does, was my first thought. I didn't dare look down at Erik in case he interpreted my look as a plea for rescue. I couldn't let either of these men think that I was unwilling in this moment, or there would be disastrous consequences. I quickly summoned an image of one of the older women and copied her mannerisms that she used when bringing the Shah to her bed. I felt ridiculous, but he seemed to accept my display of seduction. He followed me into my cell and stood in the doorway. I could feel my face flaming red. I heard Erik move into his spot outside the doorway to my cell. I resolved to be silent as I underwent this ordeal, to avoid arousing Erik's emotions unnecessarily. The Shah sat down on my cot and briefly kissed me, but nothing seemed to be happening. The Shah sighed impatiently, and I felt myself tense up even further, afraid of losing his interest. He lowered his head to my ear and whispered gruffly in it,
Relax.
I did my best, I truly did. But I could not prevent a little cry of pain. I heard Erik shift outside the door, and tried to blink back tears from my eyes. How I wished it was him in my arms at that moment. When his shadow left my doorway, I sat up slowly. All I could do was sit on the edge of my bed. My mind was far too busy trying to make sense of what had just happened to me to allow me to do anything else. I don't know how much time passed until I heard an urgent knock on the doorframe. Erik peeked in, saw me sitting there, and rushed inside to kneel before me. I listened to him babble about how he tried to save me from my recent ordeal because he loved me. My eyes filled with tears even as my heart filled with love for him. Suddenly, overcome by curiosity, I gently took the mask from his face. As I suspected, it was hideous, but it did not lessen my love for him one bit. I told him as much, but then I had to reverse myself and warn him, and, truth be told, myself, against our falling in love. I knew it would be a death sentence for both of us. I was in a state of mind where I didn't much care about dying, so I hoped desperately that his head was cooler, and he could stop both of us from hurtling headlong over this emotional cliff. As it turned out, he could not. He invited me to his room, the only one in the harem equipped with a door. I immediately began to plan how I could sneak across the main chamber in the night and into his room, into his arms. Before he left me, I divulged that I had thought of him during my recent ordeal. His face lit up like a lantern, and he kissed my hand. I grabbed his hand and kissed it in return. He looked like he was holding himself back from grabbing my head and kissing me full on the lips. But he only repeated his invitation to his room, told me he loved me, and slipped out the door. I was not permitted to spend time reviewing our conversation, as Khadija entered the room immediately after Erik's departure. I expected as much, as I knew that she had official questions to ask me after the Shah's visit. When the list of official questions was finished, Khadija followed up with one of her own. What did the servant want? I tried to keep my memory of Erik's invitation from my face as I scrambled for a lie. I had never lied before, to anyone, so I do not know how convincingly I was able to manage it. He heard me cry out and wanted to ensure I was all right. That, at least, was not a lie, although it was not the entire truth either. Khadija frowned and said, "In which case he ought to have come to fetch me. Your well-being is my responsibility, not his. You're sure that's all he wanted?" I confirmed my lie with as great a look of innocence on my face as I could manage. Mollified, she confirmed one last time that I was in a good state of mind and body, and then began to talk about how my upgraded status had earned me a better room. She told me that it was only so that the Shah would have better accommodations the next time he came to my bed. I know I paled a little at the thought. Even though I had assured Erik the Shah would leave me alone now, I was far from certain about that. A better cell seemed likely to draw him to me more often than I would like. I spent the next few hours deep inside my head, planning, weighing options, and rationalizing the actions I wanted to take when the lights went out tonight. I needed to be near someone who loved me. I needed more than anything to know that the cold transaction I had just been through was not all I had to look forward to in my whole life. Even if I only experienced a loving touch once, I could hold on to it through all the rest of the impersonal exchanges my life had in store for me. I sat in silence on my bed in the darkness of my cell for nearly an hour after the lamps in the main chamber were blown out. Rationalizations aside, I could barely bring myself to rise and set out. It was barely 50 steps to Erik's little room on the other side of the main chamber, but it might as well have been 50 leagues. I cautiously poked my head through the doorway, but could see nothing in the dim glow of the banked house. I fixed my gaze on the door that was my target and took one step forward. After that, it was easier. I had already taken one step in betrayal of my lord and master, but it was one more. Or two. They'd behead me for the first step or the 50th one, after all. I was well and truly committed. All I could do now was try to avoid being caught. I reached the door and raised my hand to it. I did not have the courage to knock, but only brushed it with the finger, creating the smallest sound I have ever heard. Erik heard it. He pulled the door open, smiled broadly, and wrapped me in his arms, pressing his lips over mine. I felt the tenderness in his embrace, and felt some of the tension go out of my spine. Suddenly, we were interrupted by a surge of illumination in the main chamber, and several cries of vindictive triumph. I broke our kiss and looked around, taking in the situation with horror. Khadija and several of her friends held lanterns and had witnessed our kiss. We were caught, and as good as dead already. I did not struggle, as Erik and I were conducted out of the harem rooms to separate cells in the dungeon. I could hear him shouting that he loved me as we were torn apart, and he continued to yell my name long after we were shut into separate cells. I did not respond to him as my mind was consumed with thoughts of death and regrets for my life. I wondered if it would hurt. That horrible night was about a year ago now. I have been kept in this cell ever since, being fed little and told less than that. I have been given only a ragged robe to clothe myself, and I am no longer permitted to cover my hair with a veil. I cannot complain, however, as I am told I brought this on myself by accepting Erik's invitation that night. I have gathered from overheard gossip that Erik wormed his way into the Shah's good graces somehow. I have tried and tried not to let hope invade my soul, hope that he might use his new elevation to free me, too, and then take me away somewhere to live with him. I do not think that is possible. What Erik and I did was a direct challenge to the Shah's absolute power over our lives, and I do not think he is the type of man to ignore such a challenge. Last night, the guards told me that this morning I will undergo a test to see if I shall live or die. I begged the guards for information, unconcerned about appearing unladylike in my persistence. They didn't tell me anything. Oddly enough, it seemed as if they couldn't tell me anything. Even the ones that were generally the most loose-lipped could not be persuaded to spill any details. I've woken up in the oddest place. Tiny rooms lead one into the other. Each room has the Shah's portrait painted on the wall, and in each room I have to close my eyes to avoid the memory of that face. I must have walked through 100 rooms before I perceived that they were arranged in a giant circle. I found the catch that opened a hidden door to the staircase quite by accident, as I slumped against the wall in temporary exhaustion and triggered it, causing a panel beside me to open. I ran up the stairs. They ran faster as I heard something slam to the ground behind me. The stairs turned left, and I took 3 steps up them before they folded flat beneath me and turned into a slide. I knocked my head on the way down, and then found myself back in what looked like the same little room I'd started out from. I searched desperately for the catch back to the staircase. It was as close as I'd come to freedom. It wasn't there. I darted into the next room and searched it too. 20 rooms later, I found the catch and saw the staircase. I ran up it again, but ended up not being able to mount the second staircase again. At least I managed to protect my head with my arms as it dropped me back into one of the little rooms. This happened twice more. I couldn't make head nor tails of this complex I found myself in. Was it even escapable? Or was someone just toying with me until my inevitable death? My last slide dropped me into the little room in such a way that something snapped in my leg, and now I'm lying here, unable to rise. The walls that have the Shah painted on them have blurred, and I squint my eyes at them, trying to make them focus. With astonishment, I realize that the walls are actually moving. But no, it's the floor that I am lying on that is moving. The room travels in an arc until it stops in a certain position. I look up, and I see the underside of a balcony, to which is attached a giant stone the approximate size of this little room I find myself in. Twin clicks sound from the doors that lead out of this room. In a panic, I grab the knob of the nearest door. It will not open. I crawl across the room and try the other knob. It is likewise locked. The stone that hovers over my head gives a jerk, as if it is about to drop on me. I refuse to cry out. It gives another jerk, and I hear a wordless cry of agony echo throughout the space from the balcony above. I know that voice. It can only be Erik. What have they just made him do? I cry out his name, Erik! As the stone descends before my terrified eyes. The stone blocks out the light. There's a flash of terrible pain, and